So, today I want to talk about people being asked to pay back their unemployment insurance payments. During the course of the pandemic, a lot of people in the United States, as well as in many other parts of the globe, relied on unemployment insurance in order to survive. In the US, with a significant lack of stimulus checks or any sort of proper preparedness on a systemic level for this type of crisis, unemployment insurance became the go to for most people who lost wages to pay for rent, to buy food, to purchase medicine, and cover any basic necessity that was required in order for them to sustain their life. This was already inadequate as it didn't provide for everybody who needed finances or care during the course of the pandemic. But at least for some, it meant a small bit of financial relief. And for those who were able to do so, it meant that job searches were waived and people could stay home and feel a small sense of security during the course of some of the pandemic. Now, naturally, this didn't expand to everybody, but again, for those that it did, it was a great help. Now that we're in a place where the status quo is trying to reassert itself as the new normal again, and the federal government's mandate on unemployment has been lifted, we are finding more and more cases where state governments are asking for this unemployment money that has been given to people to be reimbursed. Sometimes these totals have reached into the tens of thousands of dollar range, somewhere between $10,000 and $24,000 in many instances. And I know it's anecdotal, but I actually have a friend who used unemployment money to survive during the course of the pandemic, and they're now being asked to pay an absurdly high payment back to their state government. And that, honestly, is absurd. The fact that this money is being asked for when more than likely it is gone already means that people won't be able to pay it back. It's now debt. Because the fact is, people had to use it to survive. And demand the money back at this point really does reek of entrapment. Once that money is issued, especially under the circumstances we've been facing with the pandemic, it should be considered paid, the end. To ask for it back, especially after it's already been spent, is to put people, like I said, in debt, where we already have enough going on, where people are in extreme levels of poverty and have back payments from all sorts of bills, especially rent at this point, to the point where many people are about to lose their homes. And to add to this type of bait and switch is already illegal when it comes to people or companies scamming by sending any sort of item and asking for payments later. You cannot, in fact, send an item to somebody's home and then demand payment later. This, to me, is no different than that, except for the fact that it's the state providing the money and expecting it returned. If you were approved in the moment, it should be your money. Period. The end. And the fact is, very few media outlets have been covering this extensively, at least recently. There was a number of articles on it in the early parts of the pandemic, but it's been mostly local news sources that have been covering this recently. I did see one source from Business Insider, but it really didn't cover it very well. And it just tells me that a lot of the mainstream media sources are not really picking this up and talking about it, even though it is having a significant impact on a lot of people's lives. And given that we have this situation and this recent wave of repayments have been mandated since the federal government ended its mandated payments, I want to take a look at some of the local news sources and see exactly what's been happening. So we have here, when we look at Florida from the Miami Herald, the state's Department of Economic Opportunity is trying to claw back possibly billions of dollars in non-fraudulent unemployment claims distributed during the first 18 months of the pandemic. The key word there being non-fraudulent. This is not people committing fraud in mass. This is, in fact, people being asked to pay back what they were given, either because of errors by the state or because of issues within the bureaucracy. Thousands of Floridians have received stern letters warning them that they face being sent to collections if they don't reimburse the state. Some overpayment notices were mailed out actually after the deadline for recipients to appeal them. Calls to the state's hotline go unanswered or unreturned. Appealing the letters can take months. So it doesn't take them any time, to ask for the money back. But as a matter of fact, when it comes down to it, they'll send the letter to you after the point when you can't, fight against it. And then on top of it, if you try to fight against it after, the appeal will take months. meaning there's no time for them, no restriction on the state for messing up the deadline. But for people, you're going to have to wait months, and this is going to be looming over your head. When we move a little bit further into the article, we find that the demand for unemployment benefits was so great that it crushed the state's already troubled online unemployment system. In a scramble to get payments to Floridians, the department automatically sent money out without verifying the exact dates the recipient were eligible. And to me, that is an issue of the state. If you didn't fund your system properly and you weren't prepared for this, and you sent out that money, that is no longer on the people who received that money. You've made the error as the state, and that is your responsibility. And again, they didn't have the systems in place to be able to catch this ahead of time, but now they magically have all their systems working and fully functional when it comes to demanding the money back. All of a sudden, they're able to account for all of this and get all the letters out to make sure that they're paid back. But they couldn't fix things in the first place? Again, that reeks of that level of entrapment that I was talking about, where people are being put in a situation where they're being forced into debt for these situations. And I'm suspicious of this, and I have no evidence of this, but I wonder how much of this fake labor shortage is being called into question here, where they're trying to force people into positions where they have to take any job possible, instead of being able to negotiate for higher paying jobs in order for them to actually be able to get paid a living wage. Overpayment notices have created another problem for recipients. Once they get one, it actually blocks them from claiming additional benefits. And that is a huge issue and problem. Because if you are in a place where you're already financially struggling, if you already have back payments on rent, if you already have bills piling up, and the unemployment benefits have been the thing keeping you sustained, this can now make it so that you're not able to get additional funding. And given that there's no eviction moratoriums or protections, this means that people could end up falling behind on their rent and could get evicted. And it's because of the state bureaucracy failing to provide funding for people because of these notices. When we move on to another article talking about a different state, we have a situation going on in Connecticut, where amid a global pandemic and economic crisis, one person did what millions of Americans were forced to do. She submitted an unemployment claim and waited anxiously to hear if she'd receive jobless benefits to help cover her rent, utilities, groceries, car insurance, and other living expenses. Again, these are the type of things that most of the money went into. And the state is now ordering her to repay somewhere in the sum of $31,000 in benefits that she received. The question is, why would she be allowed to receive benefits for months and suddenly be ruled ineligible? How did the state expect her to repay the money when she'd been out of work for months? And the person involved was also burying their father around the same time and felt that they were being kicked while down and felt helpless and completely alone. And the situation here is really dire. People are losing family members. You've had burial costs that have had to go into people's budgets because people have died from the pandemic. We have about 700,000 deaths in the United States over the course of the pandemic, and those numbers are still going up, especially as people are unvaccinated and the Delta variant spreads. But the fact of the matter is that this is not contributing in any positive way to people's mental health and to their survivability in the current situation. In fact, what we're dealing with is people do feel like they're being kicked while they're down. They already don't have enough, and to receive a bill that says $31,000, can you imagine how anxiety-inducing that is when you can't even pay your rent that month to receive this debt collection notice? Now, state officials are in the process of reviewing and auditing a large number of unemployment claims they approved over the past year, and they've begun to issue thousands of letters instructing people to repay part or all of the benefits they received during the pandemic. Some of the payments from the state is seeking to collect have been attributed to fraud, but in many cases, they stem from unintentional mistakes on the part of the applicant or the state unemployment agency itself. I'm willing to bet that most of the cases are not fraud. I honestly believe that most of these cases are either a missing piece of documentation from the people themselves, either because the information was unclear on what they needed to provide, or because the state is somehow messed up with their bureaucracy like we saw in Florida. And I think those are going to be far more common than any sort of fraud. And I think putting people through this, for the few people that may have committed fraud, is going to do more damage and cost more to the system, as well as cause more harm to more people's lives than actually just letting it slide by right now. We were in the middle of a pandemic. We still are in the middle of a pandemic. Let people try to recover. Businesses don't usually get this kind of treatment when they get bailed out. Another issue going on is that it's likely contributing to the ballooning amount of overpayments being reported in Connecticut is the unprecedented amount of time it's taking for the state to rule on thousands of unemployment appeals. So again, there's so many situations where you have to have now these individual people appeal their applications, and it's overburdening the system in an additional way that is making it so that people are not able to be seen in a timely manner. Like we saw in the Florida situation, it was taking upwards of 3 months for people to get any sort of response. And because you have to have judges look at each individual case and manage it, that is going to make wait times go further. Instead, you could have the state just waive it all. You could have the federal government come in and waive it all. But they won't do that because they have to means test here in a way that is going to hurt more people than help anyone. We have other states where this is going on, like Wisconsin, where a couple was actually ordered to pay over $12,000 in payments for unemployment benefits. Now, fortunately, their case, they won it. However, according to the latest state data for the week ending of September 4th, there are 13,679 people waiting for their appeals to have hearings scheduled. The Department of Workforce Development said individuals appealing unemployment overpayment decisions are included in that number, but could not provide a percentage breakdown. But the fact of the matter is, judges aren't always upholding the decisions in the way they did for this one particular couple. That the system is overcomplicating things, and that the whole overcomplicated system is unnecessarily adding to people's issues and is causing more cases of errors. Others have told this particular channel that they were never given the chance or information to correct errors. And that's another thing. If people didn't receive letters, if they didn't receive access to emails, or if they didn't get any bit of the information, or maybe if they just misread something and sent something in, they didn't exactly always receive notice that said, hey, you're missing something. So they get penalized, and now they're getting hit with these bills, and now we have to go through an appeal process, which again is adding to people's stress. When we move on to Jackson, Mississippi, we have another person who was hit with a unemployment benefit repayment of about $10,000. Who makes the decision about who's qualified and who's not qualified? And why do you have to repay this money if it was their mistake? All of a sudden, I started getting some extra money. I guess it was part of the government stimulus package, said the person involved. So the benefits went up by $300, I guess, for that. And of course, I never asked for any additional money. They never asked me to qualify for any additional money. So this is a situation where, again, somebody was given $300 additionally, and you just kind of assume, oh, this is the federal government or the state government offering more benefits. Something must have changed, and, people just try to go about their lives. Not everybody is paying attention to the news all the time. Not everybody is fully aware. And if you're getting a little bit of extra money from the government, you just assume it's yours. You're probably not going to look into it, and you're just going to accept it. And when that happens, and then the government asks for it later, how can you see that as anything but entrapment? The government gave you something and is now expecting a repayment for it. And that's the same situation that I brought up earlier, where you're sent a product and then you're expected to buy it later. That is illegal for a reason, because it's a scam artist move that forces people into having to spend their money and part with their money. In August, this person had received a notice of overpayment, stating that he had to return over $9,700 that was followed by a warrant for collection of overpayment. And of course, what happens when it goes to collections, it starts affecting things like your credit score. It starts affecting how you're able to get access to money in the future, and can have long-term effects. Which means then you'd have to take all of this up with maybe your credit report or anything else, assuming you even have credit in the first place. When we move on to another state, we look at Missouri. We find that nearly 46,000 Missouri families are affected, and that they owe approximately $150 million in total. Meanwhile, the House passed a bill to end repayment of the federal funds, but time ran out in the Senate. The same thing that we see all the time. The Senate fails. The federal government decided families didn't have to repay money overpaid to them. The legislature even put some $40 million in the budget to cover state overpayments. But, quote, time ran out before legislation could be passed to forgive the state overpayment. Now, the issue here is that the governmental systems at play are failing. Whether it's the federal government, whether it's state governments, they are not putting out any sort of tools or any sort of legislation that are protecting people in this instance. What is required here is that this be done on a systemic level, where you mandate across the board federally that these types of payments do not have to be paid back. But of course, this won't happen, and that all ties to the same issues we have with the federal Senate, the filibuster, and the fact that Sinema and Manchin will not, in fact, do anything that they're supposed to, and will just keep capitulating to the interests of their corporate backers, and will continue to allow for things to get a lot worse so that nothing can actually get passed in the Senate. Meanwhile, when we move on to Colorado, we find that more than 24,000 Coloradans who receive unemployment insurance in the past year may have been overpaid and now owe that money back that they received during the pandemic. More than 23,000 PUA claimants received 4 emails since June 15th to provide documentation prior to a September 13th deadline. Within these emails, we explained to these individuals that failure to do so would result in being charged with overpayment. However, a 55-year-old person in the area of Thornton received PUA and said they never received the emails and never got notice of over $18,000, almost $19,000 until recently. I was stumped. I'm like, why are they doing this to people? If I had $18,000, I wouldn't have been on unemployment. Now, this is another issue that's happening here. A lot of people aren't necessarily tech savvy. So when you're relying on email and with all of the postal cuts that we've seen, it's unsurprising that some people are not getting the information that they need. And if somebody is not tech savvy, and especially if they're older and they do not get these emails, or they don't get the information, or maybe the bureaucracy failed and they didn't end up on the list to send the emails, wherever the blame lies, the fact of the matter is that they're not getting the notification and they can't really respond to that. Meanwhile, to just get a document that says, hey, you owe $18,000, instead of being like, hey, we understand that you were in the middle of a pandemic and maybe you didn't get the prior notifications, but we need this documentation, that would probably make a lot more sense. But that's not the kind of system that we live in. This is the kind of one that we do. And I also want to point out, just briefly, I did mention at the beginning of the video that this wasn't just happening in the United States. It actually happened in Canada as well. I have an article from December 15th of 2020, and this might not be happening quite as recently as it's happening in the US, but you had the NDP in Canada having to send a clear message to the Liberals to basically tell people that they shouldn't be penalized for applying for CERB, their equivalent, in good faith, and that basically people shouldn't be expected to have to pay it by the end of the month. And of course, with Canada having its recent election, I don't know how much of a factor this type of thing played in, but it's consistently that the NDP has to speak on behalf of people when the Liberals just keep hoeing that kind of line and end up making it so that the people in Canada have to pay something like CERB back. And this is the same kind of thing that we see from the Democrats in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have something like the NDP in the United States. At the very least, even if you could make the argument that they're not the be-all and end-all of leftist ideals, you could at the very least say that they are trying on some level to do a little bit better than what we see from, say, the Democrats. Now, in all of this, it really does seem that the system got overwhelmed, that bureaucracy, of course, failed, and now people are being held responsible for payments that have been made and likely spent already. And that's a key thing to note here. These payments have probably already been spent. People don't have the money accumulating. It's not just lying around. It went to bills. And instead of the states or federal government mandating this from above and just making it so that people's problems go away, they're doing it well how they always do. They're treating it as an individual case-by-case basis that makes it so that the state governments are not responsible for the thing they did wrong. And again, they messed up at the beginning, and they're not messing up now when it comes to the reclaiming of these monies. The fact of the matter is, they could mandate this from above, and they could just do the right thing and let people keep the money that the government gave them. Again, that's how it would work in any other instance. But this is again being handled in a way that's now overloading the system with appeals cases happening from, all the time, and the courts are backed up, and now people are going to be put in limbo for months while they could potentially fall behind on other bills and potentially lose their homes. This is adding stress and anxiety to people who have already been in a bad place for well over a year and a half, where people have been losing loved ones during the pandemic and have already been in stressful times, especially financially. And most of it, in this case, seems to be made by mistakes of the state, where they're being held responsible. Again, it's worth noting that most people can't pay for a $500 emergency, let alone these $10,000 bills that the state is essentially entrapping them with. The fact is, this should have been handled very differently from the beginning. People should have had stimulus checks from the start, and we should have kept people home as much as possible, and we shouldn't have even been in a place where means testing was the response for pandemic relief. Everyone should have just got checks to keep people safe and home. But given that this is where we are, it's unreasonable for people to have to pay back any of the money they were given for unemployment, given that it's just a small amount of extra relief that's already likely in the hands of people who took the money through bill collections, like landlords and banks. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.